It is the year 1411, and the Kingdom of France stands on the brink of total chaos. Its king is officially a madman, incapable of effectively ruling the realm. The power vacuum is filled by two court factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, whose rivalry for control of the kingdom soon erupts into a bloody civil war. The Mad King's psychotic episodes, the cold-blooded murder of the king's brother, the gruelling siege of the realm's capital, and the fierce battle for one of its outskirts. This is France on the eve of the Battle of Agincourt. At the end of the 14th century, the French kingdom was at the height of its grandeur. Just a few decades earlier, having suffered a string of humiliating defeats at Crécy and Poitiers, the once mighty kingdom nearly collapsed under the weight of the 100 Years' War. Fortunately, thanks to the wise policies of King Charles V, all lost territories were regained, and the shame of crushing defeats was redeemed by the blood of the invaders. Having restored France's military might, Charles V died in 1380, leaving the crown to his 12-year-old son, Charles VI, the Beloved. But the young monarch immediately fell under the influence of his uncles Jean of Berry and Philippe of Burgundy, who squandered the country's financial resources on their own needs and whims. Their rule had lasted 8 years, and ended in 1388 when Charles publicly announced his intention to rule on his own. Philippe and Jean were effectively removed from power and were replaced by the king's new favorite, Louis of Orléans, his younger brother. Louis held uncontested power until 1392, when an unexpected turn of events radically altered the course of French history. On August 5, 1392, Charles VI set off from Le Mans on a punitive expedition to Brittany. As the king and his escort were traveling through the forest, a barefoot leper dressed in rags rushed up to the king's horse, seized the bridle, and began to shout of treason and betrayal. The man, possibly insane, was escorted away by Charles' bodyguards, but the king was left deeply unsettled by the incident. For several weeks, he had been suffering from insomnia, loss of appetite, and recurring fevers. To make matters worse, the day picked for the expedition turned out to be one of the sultriest in recent years. Under the midday sun, sweat covered the king's horse, while Charles himself was sweltering in his black velvet tunic. At one point, a royal page riding behind Charles dozed off and let go of his spear, which hit another man's helmet with a loud clanging sound. Startled by a sudden noise, Charles jumped in his saddle. Thinking he was being attacked, the king unsheathed his sword and lunged at the knights by his side, shouting, "Forward! Attack the traitors!" He murdered 2 of his followers, injured 3 more, and then pursued his own brother, who escaped to the forest. For an hour, the king was riding among his army, until his horse was completely fatigued and his sword broke. Eventually, Charles was forced to the ground and had his splintered sword taken away from him. His uncles and his brother went to him, but he had lost all recollection of them. The king remained unresponsive, while his eyes strangely rolled in their sockets. Historians are uncertain whether it was schizophrenia or some other illness. One thing, however, was certain: Charles the Beloved had turned into Charles the Mad. Charles regained his sanity in the upcoming month, but unfortunately it was only a temporary relief. His illness resurfaced in the following year, with subsequent episodes being more frequent and lasting for longer periods of time. During one of them, the king vehemently denied ever being married and grew annoyed when Queen Isabella attempted to approach him, loudly demanding to have this woman removed from him. On multiple occasions, the king imagined being made of glass and requested to be clad in armor so as not to be shattered by accident. In the meantime, the madness of Charles VI allowed his uncles, Jean of Berry and Philippe of Burgundy, to regain power once again, sidelining Louis of Orléans. While Louis was plotting his revenge, Philippe the Bold successfully gained full control of France's government, focusing on the development of his Burgundian domains. By 1385, he had united under his rule 5 provinces: Burgundy, Nevers, Rethel, Artois, and Flanders. And now, taking advantage of his influential position at the French court, Philippe dedicated himself to the Burgundian statecraft. The consolidation of power in the Burgundian duchy did not happen out of nowhere. Even before Philippe's marriage to Margaret of Melle, who brought him Artois and Flanders, close ties had existed between the Low Countries and the 2 Burgundies. Philippe only had to combine the existing political institutions into a single entity. The Duke began by establishing the Great Council, which merged the autonomous administrations of Flanders and Burgundy, as well as creating 2 chambers of accounts in Dijon and Lille. Philippe also prioritized the economic development of prosperous Flanders. By 1391, he had reinstated free trade privileges for Flemish merchants, enabling the crucial revival of English wool imports. Consequently, in the next 10 years, the Duke's tax revenue from Flanders skyrocketed, reaching 1/3 of his total income. Thus, towards the end of the century, Philippe had transformed a rather mediocre duchy into a strong, autonomous, and more or less unified state, poised to challenge France in the near future. At the peak of his power, Philippe the Bold died in April 1404, and the Burgundian domains were divided among his sons, Jean, Antoine, and Philippe. Prince John the Fearless, the eldest brother, received the heartland of the duchy, which included the 2 Burgundies, Flanders and Artois. He was 33 at the time and full of political ambition. Small and ugly, with a long nose, a wry mouth, and an undershot jaw, wrote the French historian Edouard Perrois. He was harsh, cynical, crafty, imperious, gloomy, and a killjoy. Any means served to attain his ends, the first of which was permanent control of public affairs. In addition to the rich provinces, Jean the Fearless also inherited from his father the political rivalry with the House of Orléans. Seizing the opportunity, Louis of Orléans regained his position at court, sidelining Burgundian sympathizers and replacing them with his own men. Moreover, Louis struck a blow on the economic prosperity of the Burgundian Duke. Whereas Philippe the Bold had been receiving a yearly pension of 200,000 livres from the royal treasury, Louis immediately had this subsidy cut off. In 1405, the 2 sides began to rattle their arms. Both dukes, ready to start a feud, gathered their armies near Paris. For now, they were persuaded to reconcile, but the compromise remained fragile. At court, Louis and Jean disagreed on almost all policy matters, including how funds should be allocated, relations with England, and the approach to the Papal Schism. As an example, in 1406, when the Royal Council decided to intensify military efforts against the English, Jean the Fearless, who had been assigned to attack Calais, deliberately undermined the military campaign. The Duke's motive was obvious. He aimed to preserve the Anglo-Flemish economic ties that greatly enriched him personally, instead of letting Louis pursue his chivalric ambitions. In 1407, the Duke's rivalry reached its climax. Using his influence, Louis restructured the royal council, cutting the number of advisors in half from 51 to 26. Notably, the ones who lost their seats were the supporters of Jean the Fearless. Recognizing Louis's desire to fully remove him from politics, the Duke of Burgundy decided to completely turn the tables. On the evening of October 23, 1407, the Duke of Orleans broke off the meeting with Queen Isabella and made his way to the king. The Duke, riding on a mule, was accompanied by several followers who illuminated the road with torches. Little did they know that the urgent summons to the king was a cleverly orchestrated ploy. As the Duke's procession was traveling down the Rue Vieille du Temple, the Temple Street, masked assailants suddenly attacked from all directions. Scattering the torchbearers, they pounced on the stunned Duke. "Who are you? What's going on? I'm the Duke of Orleans!" exclaimed Louis. "You are the very man we've been looking for," replied one of the attackers, and finished off the Duke with a powerful axe strike. The young squire of Louis tried to protect his master and ended up dead beside him. Louis's death shook the royal court to its core. During the funeral, Jean the Fearless was seen weeping over the coffin of the deceased. But when the investigation commenced, the Burgundian duke, driven by an unexpected rush of feelings, confessed to his uncle, Jean of Berry, that it was he who had hired the assassins at the instigation of the demon. The Duke's remorse, however, quickly vanished, and in February 1408, Jean entered Paris not as a repentant criminal seeking forgiveness, but as a hero, likened to the legendary tyrant slayers of old. The Parisian crowd who hated Louis of Orleans for embezzlement and corruption welcomed their idol with jubilation. In the royal trial, the Duke of Orleans was declared a tyrant who deserved retribution, while Jean the Fearless was praised as a divine instrument who meted out justice. The casuistry of Jean's attorneys, multiplied by the exaltation of the Parisian crowd, resulted in the Duke's complete acquittal. The Duke of Burgundy's escape from punishment caused a strong national backlash. By 1410, a large coalition of French nobles had formed against Jean, including the Dukes of Orleans, Berry, and Brittany, as well as the Counts of Clermont, Armagnac, Alençon, and d'Albret. 16-year-old Charles, the son of the late Louis and the new Duke of Orleans, became the formal leader of the faction. However, it was his father-in-law, the energetic and ruthless Bernard d'Armagnac, who really held the reins of power and gave the faction its name. The Orleanist party, commonly referred to as the Armagnacs, started plotting their revenge for the murder of the king's dearest brother. In April of 1411, the Armagnacs assembled their army near Soissons. Following this, the Duke of Orleans sent a letter to the king demanding the expulsion of Burgundian supporters from the royal council. Since the sick Charles VI was unable to handle political matters, and the country was governed by Jean the Fearless and Queen Isabella, the demands remained unanswered. In response, the enraged Armagnacs issued a proclamation in which they branded Jean as a criminal, liar, and traitor, openly accusing him of murdering the Duke of Orleans and usurping power. Jean the Fearless accepted the challenge and, having sent a similar letter of insults to the Armagnacs, hurried back to Burgundy to gather his troops. All masks were now off. France had finally descended into an open civil war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, a conflict that would divide the country for a generation and open the door for an invasion and partial occupation of France by the English. Despite the delayed mobilization, the Burgundian Duke was able to gather a force of 10,000 men by September. The towns of Flanders, particularly Ghent, contributed most of Jean's infantry and artillery, yet the discipline in the Flemish contingent left much to be desired. The first month of the war saw active fighting unfold in Picardy. Jean the Fearless quickly moved towards Aum, and the Armagnacs were forced to evacuate the garrison in a hurry, leaving the town's residents to their fates. Left unprotected, Aum fell to the Burgundians, who looted the town. The Flemish showed particular ruthlessness, seizing anything within their grasp and even forcefully taking valuables away from their allies. Aum's tragic fate forced the Armagnacs to withdraw to Montdidier, where they intended to confront Jean in a decisive engagement. The Duke of Burgundy was willing to do battle, but the Flemish interfered once more. They refused to fight, burned their tents, gave a beating to the Picard and English soldiers who tried to stop them, and headed home with their plunder and artillery train. The Duke caught up with the deserters and implored them to stay for at least 4 more days. His pleas fell on deaf ears. The Flemish stated their term of service had expired, and bringing forth the military contract with Jean's own signature, they pushed the disappointed Duke aside and carried on with their march. With half of his army and almost all the artillery gone, Jean had no other choice but to retreat to Arras. Suddenly, the military initiative fell into the hands of the Armagnacs, and they started deliberating on their next actions. Experienced military leaders such as Constable Charles d'Albret advised pursuing the enemy to deliver a decisive blow. However, his counsel was ignored, and the Armagnac army advanced on Paris. Charles of Orléans and Bernard d'Armagnac were convinced that gaining control over the capital, especially with King Charles VI residing there, was an asset too important to ignore. The Duke of Orléans arrived at the walls of Paris with his troops on October 3, 1411, but soon discovered that no one was going to open the gates to him. Fully loyal to the Duke of Burgundy, the Parisians were determined to defend their city to the last man. Along with the 800-strong Parisian militia, there was also a Burgundian garrison of 2,500 soldiers in the city. The garrison was led by Valéron, the Count of Saint-Pol, as well as Enguerrand de Bournonville, a seasoned Burgundian captain from Picardy. In addition, some 650 Burgundians defended the neighboring town of Saint-Denis, while all unguarded crossings over the Seine had been destroyed in advance. The Armagnacs pitched their camp amidst the vineyards on the hill of Montmartre. They were clearly in a predicament. Assaulting such a densely populated city filled with professional soldiers and fervent citizens was hardly a viable option. Overcoming its resistance required a protracted siege, a luxury the Armagnacs could ill afford. Their financial resources were dwindling away, while the approach of winter complicated the already challenging task of maintaining supply lines. But in spite of these challenges, the Armagnacs' morale remained high. So intense was their yearning for revenge against the Duke of Burgundy and his supporters in Paris. The issue of supplies was temporarily settled as well. The Armagnac commander Cligny de Brabant dispatched heavily armored foraging parties, which crushed the resistance of local peasants with fire and sword. During the first 10 days after arriving outside Paris, the Armagnacs concentrated all their efforts on capturing Saint-Denis. This town's significance stemmed from its cultural and religious background. Here, the famous Basilica of Saint-Denis was located, which served as the final resting place for French monarchs, and, what was more important for the Armagnacs, contained an impressive treasury. The besiegers bombarded the town walls with trebuchets and diverted the river Crawl, which served as the main water source for the citizens. In addition, the Armagnacs partially drained the town's moat and successfully brought siege towers up the walls. The Burgundian defenders of Saint-Denis fended off all the attacks, but on October 11th, when they had almost run out of defense options, decided to surrender in return for a safe passage to Paris. When the scheduled day came, the Armagnac leaders entered Saint-Denis and seized the abbey treasury. Most of this money was immediately used to pay off the arrears of their contracted soldiers. With the capture of Saint-Denis accomplished, the Armagnacs' next step was to cross the Seine. The fortified bridge in the small town of Saint-Cloud, west of Paris, became their new target. The bridge was guarded at its western end by a moated stone keep with a drawbridge on each side. Realizing that a direct attack would result in failure, the Armagnac captain, Raoul de Gaucourt, turned to cunning. Shortly before dawn, a team of 300 men crossed the river on rafts, infiltrated the citadel using ropes, and dropped one of the drawbridges. The garrison was caught completely off guard. The fortress commander in particular was still in bed with his wife when armed men burst into the room. By capturing the bridge, the Armagnacs were able to establish a firm foothold on the left bank of the Seine, effectively cutting off the primary supply route to Paris. The Bretons and Gascons poured over the bridge and ran amok in the southern suburbs of Paris, breaking into churches and granaries, wrecking houses and farm buildings. Mid-October brought the first frosts to Paris. The besieged French capital now faced a severe lack of firewood and essential food supplies. Public sentiment worsened with each passing day. Most of the citizens blamed the Count of Saint-Pol for losing Saint-Cloud in the southern suburbs, given the Count's reputation for excessive military caution. To placate the crowds, the Count organized several sorties, but they all proved to be ineffective and only exacerbated the situation. The Parisians now directed their wrath at anyone who was suspected of sympathizing with the enemy. Fearing that they may soon lose control over the city, the Count of Saint-Pol and Enguerrand de Bournonville repeatedly sent urgent letters to Jean the Fearless, urging him to come to their aid as soon as possible. By that time, the Duke was already en route. He led around 5,000 men-at-arms and almost 3,800 archers, a smaller force than in September, but a lot more disciplined. Englishmen from the Earl of Arundel's expeditionary corps made up over half of the archers and about 1/10 of the men-at-arms. Unencumbered by heavy artillery and slow-moving Flemish infantry, the Anglo-Burgundian forces swiftly made their way to Paris and successfully entered the city in the early morning of October 23rd. Despite their sympathies for the Duke of Burgundy, the citizens of Paris were initially hostile towards the foreign allies. The Parisian householders, never keen to put up soldiers, were particularly unwilling to accommodate the English. Despite this, relations gradually improved due to a series of cavalry raids that Jean promptly organized upon his arrival in the city. On October 24th, a joint force of the Parisians and the English under the command of Enguerrand de Bournonville launched an attack on the main Armagnac camp. The Breton contingent stationed there suffered heavy casualties and had to quickly retreat behind the walls of Saint-Denis. In the following days, English raiding parties infiltrated Ile-de-France, defeating the Armagnac foraging squads and disrupting their poorly protected supply lines. Meanwhile, Jean was devising a much bolder move. He was going to expel the Armagnacs from Saint-Cloud and drive them back to the right bank of the Seine. This was a much larger undertaking than the original capture had been, as the Armagnacs had prepared the town for defense. Another bridge, this time made of wood, had been constructed next to the original one. Additionally, the Armagnacs had set up an improvised barricade around the residential quarters made of timber palisades and barrels filled with stones. A formidable garrison of 1,500 men defended these positions. Shortly before midnight, on November 9th, the Duke of Burgundy left the southern gate of Paris at the head of his army. Under cover of darkness, they reached Saint-Cloud by 8 in the morning. As the troops were taking up positions around the fortifications, the Burgundian commanders decided to set fire to the newly built wooden bridge by using boats filled with combustible materials. This ended in complete failure. The Saint-Cloud garrison swiftly responded and put out the fire before the bridge sustained any significant damage. After the incident with the burning boats, Jean the Fearless had no other choice but to take Saint-Cloud by frontal assault. He allocated a part of his force to capture the wooden bridge, while the rest were traditionally split into 3 battles to launch an attack on the town fortifications. In the meantime, the Parisians climbed up the hill behind the town and assembled trebuchets. When it finally dawned, the roar of trumpets signaled the start of the assault, and the stone throwers began relentless bombardment of the Armagnacs' barricades. Although the defenders were prepared to fight back, they were immediately overwhelmed by the enemy's numerical advantage. Breaking through the barricades, the advancing Burgundians engaged in a fierce melee, pushing the Armagnacs back into the streets and further towards the fortress. The cavalry reserve held by the Armagnacs on the riverbank could have saved the situation. However, the English archers under the Earl of Arundel climbed onto the rooftops of the nearby houses and unleashed a barrage of arrows upon the Armagnac cavalry, wounding their horses and ultimately scattering the last reserve of the defenders. The battle for Saint-Cloud was notable for extreme brutality. The clash between the 2 rival factions for control of the kingdom left no room for chivalric conventions. Surprisingly, the English were the only ones who took prisoners and cared for them on that bloody day. Both the Armagnacs and the Burgundians took none. Many of the dead were noble lords who, under normal circumstances, could expect honorable captivity and eventual ransom. Around 600 Armagnacs lost their lives on the streets of Saint-Cloud before their defenses finally collapsed. The majority of survivors rushed to the fortress seeking refuge. Yet those who reached it first pulled up the drawbridge, thus condemning their companions in the town to certain death. Having lowered the drawbridge on the opposite side, the Armagnacs rushed to the other bank. But there were so many of them that the logs on the bridge could not hold this crowd, and the whole structure collapsed, casting the unfortunate fugitives into the freezing waters of the Seine. Gradually, the soldiers of Jean the Fearless cleared up the remaining pockets of resistance in Saint-Cloud. One group of Armagnacs sought refuge in the keep, fought back desperately, but was eventually annihilated. Another group climbed the bell tower of the parish church, which was stormed with heavy losses by the Earl of Arundel and his men. By the time the fighting finally ceased, it was already past midday. The Burgundians passed through the town looking for survivors. Another 300 Armagnacs were pulled out of their hiding places and hacked to death. The capture of Saint-Cloud was an impressive success for Jean the Fearless and his allies. The Armagnac leaders rushed to the battlefield with 2,000 men-at-arms, but were too late. When they reached the bridge, they could see the triumphant Burgundians lined up on the opposite bank of the Seine. At the ensuing war council, the Armagnacs decided to end the campaign. Given their substantial casualties and significant erosion of their prestige, the only sensible option for them was to retreat from Paris, regroup, build up their forces, and try their military luck again next year. Throughout 1412, Jean the Fearless and his Burgundian forces maintained a strong military advantage, winning multiple engagements across France and inflicting significant damage on Orléans and Barratt, the lands held by the Armagnac leaders. However, while basking in the glory of his military achievements, Jean failed to notice that the French population, even in loyal Paris, quickly distanced themselves from the Duke due to economic hardships. The storm broke out on April 27, 1413, as the Parisians erupted in an uncontrollable outburst of anger, which became known as the Cabochon Revolt. Jean had no other choice but to admit defeat and left the capital, which, for the first time since the Civil War started, was taken over by the Armagnacs. The Armagnacs scheduled a decisive counteroffensive against the Duke of Burgundy for 1414. They assembled a sizable army near Saint-Denis, inspired it by the symbolic presence of the king, and then marched into Picardy. Despite putting up a strong resistance, the Burgundian garrison in Compiègne was eventually forced to surrender. Soissons, the next Burgundian stronghold, successfully resisted the Armagnacs for a long time. Anglo-Burgundian de Bournonville himself led the defense, conducting sorties and inflicting significant casualties on the enemy. On May 21st, driven by a strong desire for revenge, the Armagnacs launched a fierce attack on Soissons from 5 directions. Crushing the garrison's resistance, they mercilessly looted the town, killing 1,200 civilians and stealing church relics. The captured Anglo-Burgundian de Bournonville was sentenced to death, but while on the scaffold he made a peculiar request for a glass of wine. He then raised the glass and drank to the health of the Duke of Burgundy, as well as the death of all his enemies. The pointless war was consuming the finances of both sides, inevitably pushing all parties to the conflict to political and economic ruin. Flying at each other's throats, the French princes hardly noticed that the dark clouds of foreign invasion were rapidly gathering over France. On the other side of the channel, the newly crowned King of England engaged in menacing saber-rattling, openly preparing to resume the 100 Years' War. Next time, we will discuss Henry V's first invasion of France, which culminated in the fateful Battle of Agincourt. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, help others discover it too. Hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for the upcoming episodes. Until next time.